When love cast me out, it was cruelty who took me in. That line goes so hard, and it is one of the core lines that expresses the philosophy of Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. And that's what I want to explore today, in a very hot take where I argue that Kushiel's Dart's underlying philosophy has a lot in common with Stoicism's core tenets. Welcome to Actually It Is That Deep with Marie Mullaney. We are going to cover Kushiel's Dart's plot in almost complete totality today. So if you haven't read the book, if you don't want spoilers, come back after you've read the book, or you can try and skip ahead to my thematic analysis, but I'm not sure it'll make sense without the plot context. Okay, so with the spoiler warnings out of the way, let's talk about Kushiel's Dart. Our main character is Phaedra, and she is also the first-person narrator of the book. And we get the whole book from her perspective, as though she's telling us the story much later in her life. She was born as damaged goods. All right, so first I need to just sketch very briefly. In the country of Terre d'Ange, they live by a precept as love as thou wilt, and sex work is a core tenet of their religion, right? So there are these 12 houses of the night court, which are essentially really high-class brothels, and they are a core part of life in the city, and people visit them openly and freely, and there are both men and women who are trained to serve in these night courts from a very young age, not just as sex workers, but also as companions, as courtesans, essentially, right? So they are very kind of high class and very esteemed in their society. Okay, so Phaedra is born into this world to her mother. Now, her mother engaged in an unsanctioned marriage because the night court is very orientated around bloodlines, and their version of bloodlines, not noble bloodlines. There's that as well, but we'll get to that. So her mother had an unsanctioned marriage, and this resulted in Phaedra being born with a blood fleck in her eye. Right, she had this red blood fleck in her eye, and thus she was considered damaged goods. The way that she puts it is, thus did I enter the world, with an ill-luck name and a pinprick of blood emblazoned in my gaze. Okay, so she's sold to the night court to Ceres' house in order to cover her father's debts. All right. You know, none of this stuff is modernity. It is what it is. It's kind of set back in the, I would say, the high Middle Ages, roughly speaking. So anyway, so she's sold to Ceres' house to cover this debt. So she's now got this debt, she's got this blood fleck in her eye, and so on. But you know, she lives as a child will, and it's not a bad existence. She's not a slave, she's an indentured servant, right? And she makes friends with a young man called Hyacinth by running away into the city. And this whole thing leads her to discover that she really likes pain, even as a child, right? And this enjoyment of pain eventually brings her to the attention of Anafil Delaney, who puts a name to what she is. The book says, he put his poet's hand on me and named me. And what he named her as is Kushiel's chosen, who Kushiel is the chief of their punisher. He was the punisher of the one god who fled from the one god to become the punisher in the pantheon of the Dangelines. And he sometimes selects a chosen who is called Anguisettes, and they find pleasure in pain. They are born masochists, right? So that is what Phaedra is. And her debt is then bought by Delaney. And Delaney takes her into his household, and with his other ward, Alcyone, he trains Phaedra and Alcyone in the art of covertry, in the art of being a spy. Okay? He trains them to be courtesans and spies. And he sends them out into the noble houses of Terre d'Ange in order to gather information for him. And in the beginning of the book, the first part of the book, the core kind of plot is that Phaedra is trying to figure out why they're doing all this. What is Delaney's end goal? And during this whole process, she meets a patron and goes with a patron called Melisande. And Melisande is something of a friend of Delaney's. And, you know, you meet her as like this very beautiful woman who is very deadly and who is a sadist. But within the context of Terre d'Ange, being a sadist is perfectly all right, as long as there's always consent, right? So as long as you never break the safe word, and as long as you have consent for what you're doing, then it is permissible under their religion and under their morals of love as thou wilt. Also, during this period, she gains a bodyguard because things happen and Delaney assigns her a bodyguard, which is a Casseline servant called Jocelyn Verrule. Now, the Casseline Brotherhood is this very uptight group of celibate men who stand out in the world of Terre d'Ange because they don't believe in this approach of love as thou wilt and so on. They believe that through Kushiel, the Dangelines will be returned to the one God by turning away from their hedonistic nature. And as such, they have this like martial discipline where they serve as bodyguards because that's what Kushiel did for Eloah. He was Eloah's bodyguard. So they are bodyguards to the nobles and to the royalty and so on. And Delaney pulls some strings and gets one of them to serve for Phaedra. And of course, this is a great clash of both morality and personalities. They are very, very different people. About halfway through, Phaedra discovers that Delaney is all about trying to keep Ysandra, the Dauphin, the princess in waiting to the king, you know, the heir apparent, safe and to ensure that she reaches the throne, because he was the lover of her father, Roland, and he swore a battlefield oath to Roland when Roland lay dying at the Battle of the Three Princes that he would ensure Ysandra's safety. Okay, cool. So she finds that out. But within, like, I don't know, less than a day of finding it out, perhaps even that same night, Delaney is betrayed. And he and Alcyone are killed. And while Phaedra is out of the house, and she goes to the palace to try and find somebody to tell this to say what's going on, to figure out what's going on. And Melisande finds her. And Phaedra, thinking that Melisande is Delaney's friend, tells her what happened. And it turns out that Melisande was behind Delaney's betrayal. And she sells Phaedra and Jocelyn as slaves to the Scaldi. And that takes us into the second half of the book. So far we've had the setup of the world of Terre d'Ange, this very rich, lush world premised on this concept of consent and love as thou wilt. You can love in any way that you like, but you must have this concept of consent is very strong among them. And that then brings us to the Scaldi, where Phaedra and Jocelyn are both actual slaves. And Phaedra is used by the Scaldi men without her consent. And the book really thoroughly explores here the difference between the kind of joy that she took in being used hard as a masochist, but with consent, versus she's not as hard used here. I mean, these men aren't sadists. They just want to get laid. But they don't get her consent. They just use her. They just rape her. And that lack of consent is a core theme of why this is worse than, getting whipped and beaten and used in a very hard way that required days of recovery afterward. But all of that was with her consent. Right, so there's a lot of deep exploration there of sexuality and the importance of consent and identity and so on. Then eventually, Phaedra and Jocelyn escape with some really critical knowledge in their heads about the coming Scaldi invasion into Terra d'Ange and traitors within the Terra d'Ange nobility. And they flee back to Terra d'Ange and they manage to make their way all the way to the capital. And there they meet with Ysandra, who has now become queen because her father is on his deathbed and in fact dies within 3 days of their arrival at the capital. And this leads to Ysandra saying, well, she wants to make an alliance with the Picti who live across the straits. And to do that, she needs an ambassador to go and tell Drustin, her potential beloved, that she is ready to take him as a husband, if he'll, come and help put down the rebellion, basically. Very marriage politics, but at the same time, there is love and trust between Ysandra and Drustin. So Phaedra agrees to go. They go. Lots of shenanigans ensues. And during the course of the passage, her friend Hyacinth needs to pay a terrible, terrible price to ensure their passage. He needs to take the place of the Master of the Straits, who is a cursed entity. And he basically gives up all of his freedom in return for Phaedra making the passage and being successful in her quest. It's a very poignant moment when he yields all his freedom, having been called the Prince of Travelers, in order to enable Phaedra's duty. Now, Drustin has his own problems, and eventually they sort those out, and they manage to get an army back across to Terra d'Ange. And there, one of the key attributes that is explored is there's a traitor called Isidore d'Aglamort, who Phaedra offers him a chance at redemption. He's going to die in the last battle, but he can die on the side of the country he loves, or he can die a traitor. And so he agrees, and she offers him this as a sort of a harsh mercy, right? It is the mercy of Kushiel, her patron deity, right? Who says, you can get redemption, but you must suffer for it. Like, you cannot just be forgiven. You must expiate your actions. In some cases, actions have consequences. And Isidore d'Aglamort's case, those consequences are death, but he can choose whether he dies a hero or a villain. And he chooses to die a hero. There's a lot of battlefield action. There's a very devastating scene where Phaedra is nearly skinned, but she manages to take information to the castle that enables them to win the battle in the end. And then right at the end, Melisande is captured and she escapes she's condemned to death, okay, because her role was key in all this. But in the end, she escapes. Now, the one thing that I want to highlight about her escape that I found really fantastic as a literary device ties into how she escaped. And you don't find this out in book 1. So this is a spoiler for book 2. Jump ahead to the next chapter in order to avoid the spoiler, if you haven't read Kushiel's Chosen. Okay, so when Phaedra and Jocelyn escaped from the Scaldi, when they were captured and they were slaves, Phaedra convinced Jocelyn to kill a man, to murder a man so that they would escape, right? She convinced a Casseline Brotherhood to a Catiline brother to engage not in battlefield action, but in actually just straight up murder. And doing that, they escape. And we later find out that Melisande convinced a Catiline brother to murder for her for different reasons. His reasons were centered in revenge and so on. But she convinced the Catiline brother to do exactly the same as Jocelyn, to murder for her so that she could escape. And I just thought that that was so very, very nicely done in terms of showing how the actions can be the same, but the motivation matters. It matters why you took these actions and how they weigh on you. It never weighed on Melisande. It weighed on both Phaedra and Jocelyn. Okay, so much for the actual plot story. Let's talk about theme. It occurs to me that during main filming, I forgot to ask you to sign up for my newsletter. So please sign up for my newsletter down below, and you'll get a really cool newsletter that comes out 4 times a year. And I'll get to be able to tell you when I do really cool stuff, like release a new book. Okay, now back to the show. First, pain and pleasure is really sacred. The spice in this book is extreme, right? There is direct enough spice to make book talks, little hearts sing. But every single erotic scene serves the plot or the character development. At no point is there a scene that is purely for titillation. At no point is there an agony that Phaedra suffers that is not relevant to the story. Also, there's a much deeper exploration of pain and pleasure than just in masochism, because Phaedra feels like this agony of sweet sorrow, even at emotional pain. So it goes far deeper than just the physical, just the body. And it's a very deep exploration of sex as worship, Kushiel as punishment and mercy. Phaedra's endurance does plot work. She's a survivor because of it. She can bear pain because of it. She can endure the plot because of it. And let me just say, Phaedra is in no way, shape, or form a warrior. She doesn't pick up a sword. She doesn't get good at any of that stuff. I have nothing against women warriors. I've written a few myself. No shade there. But Phaedra is a strong female character because of completely other reasons. Because she herself is a strong character who can endure and deal with what the world throws at her. And Jocelyn, her perfect companion, is a strong male character who is in fact a warrior, who is a peerless warrior. But he goes through an incredible growth arc where he goes from this brittle character to this very, very strong character who holds his identity deep within himself. Okay, so pleasure and pain is mixture. Then the other element that is explored extensively in the book is that yielding is not weakness. In fact, the line that is used is that which yields is not always weak. And that is 100% how Phaedra is portrayed. She's always yielding. She's on her knees half the time. But even though she yields, she is not weak. She is strong. She has agency. She moves the plot even when she's bound and yielding and weak and getting a patron off. The second theme that is really hit is love, loyalty, and duty. And this is between Phaedra and Jocelyn, who are very, very steadfast. It is also in the exploration of love as an uncontrollable craving, which is what Phaedra feels for Melisande, because Melisande is the sadist to her masochist, and they fit together very well, and it explores that craving of love. It also explores the concepts of duty, the duty you have to a lover who's died that you've sworn a vow to, like Anna Delaunay. and your duty that you have as a leader, like Yasandra does, her duty to her people and her land and her countrymen. And then it does a very deep exploration of freedom and servitude and the meaning of consent. The Phaedra's mark is this tattoo that is put up her back, and she needs to pay for it to be completed before she can be free of her indebtedness. And that represents the freedom of her indentured servitude. Then, of course, that is sharply contrasted with her time in Scaldia, where she is actually a slave and has no agency, no consent, and the difference between these two things. And then also with Hyacinth, with his freedom, who gives up his freedom and takes on this curse of servitude to become the master of the straits, and that sharp contrast with freedom and servitude. So, that's a literary analysis, I guess you could get anywhere. Why do I say, though, that it ties back to Stoicism? Jacqueline Carey stages this mediation on the paradox of freedom through love and suffering. The book argues that pain is not the negation of joy. It can be one of its inputs, one of its necessities, one of its conditions. What makes this interesting is not the BDSM on the surface. That makes it fun to read. But what takes it deeper is that consent transforms suffering to holiness, right? Consent is what makes the difference here. And that is what I say ties back to Stoicism. Stoicism has this concept of Amor Fati, love your fate, embrace what is yours without bitterness. And Carey dramatizes this in Kushiel's dart with Phaedra. She is born marked, as she says, I had a flaw, I was flawed goods, I was a whore's unwanted get. She also says, when love cast me out, cruelty took me in. But in none of this is Phaedra bitter. She understands and accepts her fate as it is, and that lives the principle of Amori Fati. Phaedra doesn't just accept her fate, she accepts it with grace. And then there's pain, not avoided but integrated. Epictetus had a great saying, do not seek for events to happen as you wish, but wish for events to happen as they do happen, and your life will go smoothly. And Epictetus was a slave philosopher, so that line goes hard. Anyway, so Phaedra embodies this again. As we'll see in our exploration of the series, in the third book, that goes even further, even deeper. So make sure you're subscribed for that exploration, which is coming up soon. And then there's the identity which is chosen in response to circumstances. Seneca tells us that we cannot control what life gives us, we can only control how we meet that life. And Phaedra meets her life with courage and love, which is at the center of her philosophy. Love as thou wilt. She sticks to her principles and meets her life with grace. In Kushiel's dart, love is not sentimentality. It's not soft pillows or spice or romance. Love is duty lived out. Carey's love as thou wilt echoes Marcus Aurelius's waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. In the same way, that love is the strength at the center of the Dangeline culture. And that is my hot take on Kushiel's dart. It is Stoicism refracted through a sensual theological lens. Where Camus gives us an absurd universe And the Stoics gives us rational acceptance. Kushiel gives us gods and lashes. But the moral lesson rhymes. Meaning comes from embracing what you are in full and with grace, and choosing to love even when it hurts. And that deep philosophy carries forward into Kushiel's Chosen, where Phaedra faces an almost Kierkegaardian choice in terms of how absurd it is to choose between who she is and who she loves. And we will explore that next month. So hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up button, let me know in the comments if you've read the book, let me know in the comments if there's a book series you would love me to explore, and I will see you soon for another one.